Can you provide a window for us into the role women played during the Revolutionary period?
Sure. I have worked on that. Was the beginning of my work in women's history was about women in the revolution. What I'm going to talk about comes from the research I did years ago for my book, which is called Liberty's Daughters: The Revolutionary Experience of American Women, 1750 to 1800. And I might add, it's still in print with Cornell University Press in case anybody wants to pick up a copy of it. But one of the things I discovered, or I should say that when I started my interest in women's history, let me just go back a little bit. And I had always been interested in the revolution. I did my dissertation on the loyalists of the revolution. And I was not particularly interested in women at that time when I did the dissertation. But as I said earlier, with the rise of the feminist movement in the early 70s, I got interested in thinking about women and the revolution, which was not something that had ever occurred to me before. And I was interested in two questions: what impact did women have on the revolution, and what impact did the revolution have on women? And so that's what the book is about. It's about both those questions. The question you asked was about what impact women had on the revolution. And I can tell you that one of the things that happened, especially in the run up to the revolution, that is in the 1760s, is that women began to organize for the first time, really, for political events. And they commented in their correspondence, which I read extensively for my book, that they knew they were not supposed to be talking about politics because that was what men did, but they were so interested because everyone else was talking about politics. There's a wonderful letter from Sally Franklin, Benjamin's daughter, to her father in London. And she talks about how everyone is talking about these topics. Everyone's talking about the Stamp Act. Everybody's talking about other issues. And so she found it hard to ignore those issues. And other women, too, said the same thing. And so as the resistance to Britain developed in the 17th, one of the things that the colonists did to go short of armed resistance, which they went to later, was consumer boycotts. And if you're running a consumer boycott in the 17th, just as you would in the modern period, women did most of the shopping. And so that meant that women had to be enlisted to boycott goods. In this case, the colonists wanted to boycott goods imported from Britain because they believed that this would place pressure on the British merchants who sold goods to America, and that once they did that, the merchants who sold goods to America would then pressure their representatives in Parliament to change the policies that the Americans were objecting against. So it was a very convoluted argument, but of course, there were no American representatives in Parliament, at least not technically. There were a couple of Americans who had seats in Parliament, but they had been elected from British cities. And so one of the things that women did was to sign on to consumer boycotts. That is, they agreed not to buy certain British goods. And in particular, they agreed not to buy British textiles because textiles was one of the major things that Americans bought from the British. And so one of the things they did was to set up groups that did symbolic meetings, and they are symbolic because they didn't do that much physically, but to set up meetings where the women from a town would gather and they would spin together. They would bring their spinning wheels. They couldn't bring their looms. The looms were too big, but they would bring their spinning wheels and they would gather at some central location, often at the home of the minister, and they would spend the day spinning. And at the end of the day, there would be prizes for the women who'd spun the most or the best of the flax or the wool, whatever they were spinning. And they would try to engage in, shall we say, enlightening conversation while they did this. They would only drink American beverages. That is, they would not drink imported tea because that was something else that was being boycotted. So it would be written up in the newspapers, and these groups were called Daughters of Liberty, and that was the parallel to the Sons of Liberty, who were the leaders of the street demonstrations against the British in the 1760s. So one of the things I investigated in my book was these groups and how often they met and how they were publicized, because a lot of it had to do with them being seen as publicized opponents of British policy and therefore promoting to others. That is, newspaper editors would promote this to others. How much women actually did is not clear. How much new cloth they actually made is not clear.